WHO would get a global pandemic treaty. Do you remember that? That would grant it significant influence globally to manage health crises, including pressuring other countries, including the United States. But now the organization is, let's say, struggling to get by. This is the United Nations itself. It says recent funding cuts have caused severe disruptions to health services in almost 3/4 of all countries. Which country then was basically propping up the health policies of 3/4 of all countries? Well, here's what it says. Speaking on Thursday at a press conference in Geneva, Tedros said that in around 25% of countries, some health facilities have had to close completely due to cuts, according to figures from more than 100 countries compiled by WHO. It says this: out-of-pocket payments for health services had led to disruptions to the supply of medicines and other health products, as well as rising job losses in the healthcare sector. As a result, quote, countries are revising budgets, cutting costs, and strengthening fundraising and partnerships, said the UN Health Agency chief. So where did all that money come from? What's making it so all these countries don't have those health policies, right? Well, a lot of that was because Donald Trump and his administration began cutting U.S. funding to it. Now, this happened during Trump's flurry of executive orders on his first day of office.
Withdrawing from the World Health Organization.
Ooh, that's a big one. So we paid $500 million to World Health when I was here, and I terminated it. China, with 1.4 billion people, we have 350. China pays 39 million, and we pay 500 billion. And China's a bigger country.
And now, well, the aftermath of the U.S. withdrawal is becoming clearer. The WHO is cutting jobs and slashing their budgets now. Reuters said this. The World Health Organization, WHO, is proposing to reduce staff numbers and the scale of its work as it slashes its budget by just over 1/5 due to the impact of U.S. funding cuts, according to an internal memo seen by Reuters. It says the U.S. is by far the UN Health Agency's biggest financial backer, contributing around 18% of its overall funding. And they say, quote, the United States' announcement, combined with recent reductions in official development assistance by some countries to fund increased defense spending, has made our situation much more acute, stated the WHO memo, which was dated March 28th and signed by WHO's Director General Tedros. And it says the U.S. withdrawal has exacerbated a funding crisis due to member states reducing their development spending, faced with an income gap of nearly $600 million this year. The WHO has proposed to slash its budget for 2026 to 2027 by 21%, which is about what the U.S. cut, by the way, from U.S. $5.3 billion to U.S. $4.2 billion, according to the memo. So it's important to note, it's not only just the U.S. spending less, it's also that the U.S. is making like Europe pay their fair share in defense, trying to, and that's cutting their ability to give it more money as well. Now, Trump did suggest if we can work out a better deal, there is a chance he might renegotiate with the World Health Organization. But remember, when he pulled the United States out of the WHO during his first term in office, it was because the United Nations agency was not able to demonstrate its independence from communist China. And also, look, even with the funding cuts, the World Health Organization is not dropping its other initiatives. For example, its push for the pandemic treaty is still underway. They're still pushing for it. Politico just said this, by the way. It says the WHO members have reached an agreement in principle over how to tackle future pandemics. After 3 years of discussions, the co-chair of the negotiating body told the agency France Press on Saturday. Says still to be signed off on is contentious language covering the sharing of technology for pandemic-related products such as drugs, vaccines, and therapeutics. Developing countries have pushed for a strong language that will ensure they are able to scale up production in their own regions rather than waiting in line for critical technologies. Now look, in terms of the broader picture of what Trump's spending cuts and withdrawals and elimination programs, what this actually does, the U.S. withdrawal from the WHO is just one piece of this. There's a lot of other stuff. The actions to significantly cut programs under USAID, Those got a lot of attention. A lot of people paid attention to that. But there were similar ones to that, similar organizations and spending that were also cut and that were being used for similar ways, right? For example, there was USIP, that's the U.S. Institute of Peace. Have you heard of that? Well, that organization has now been severely impacted. Now, this is after the Trump administration fired nearly the entire staff of the headquarters of the organization in Washington, D.C. on Friday, according to multiple reports. The USIP was created by Congress. It's a U.S.-funded think tank. It also allegedly works to prevent and resolve global conflicts. It's framed by a lot of critics as basically a color revolution organization. The Trump administration alleges that its goal to stop all these conflicts has not been met, and so the idea is, well, why are we keeping it? And it's now facing some reshuffling and investigations from the Doge Department because of that. And it's not even just there. There are a lot of other organizations, other programs, funding channels, other issues that all help to fund and support global initiatives which tend to be very politically divisive. They tended to help people on the left, maybe the far left. Among these, Planned Parenthood. There is a very large legal battle right now going on over the Planned Parenthood funding. And this is particularly around whether or not it can use Medicaid to help run its operations, taxpayer-funded money. And the implications from a looming Supreme Court ruling on this could likewise have some big ripple effects through the entire
Medicaid going overseas.
Yet at the heart of the case is the question of whether federal law unambiguously bestows Medicaid patients with the right to choose a specific provider. Planned Parenthood and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals says it does. But the state of South Carolina, which bars taxpayer funding of abortion, meaning the state can ban it, but people can use Medicaid to pay for it still, says the law empowers states to decide which providers are qualified for Medicaid funding, like if they ban a certain organization. And as South Carolina has asked the Supreme Court to step in, now look, that story is going to change a lot depending on who you're talking to, but basically, it allows states to deny Medicaid funding for select organizations, Planned Parenthood in this case. And that would mean if people are on Medicaid, a state could restrict them from using abortion services. No way around it. For example, with Planned Parenthood as a state-funded service. And that would also cut very deeply into the organization's finances. The scissors are reaching up to it, right? Now, part of the argument for that is religious. A lot of Americans have a religious dispute with abortion. And it goes into whether they believe there's a human soul or not, right? And if this violates somebody's religion, they probably don't want their tax dollars being used for it either, because you're forced to pay taxes. Would you want your tax dollars being used for something that goes against your religious beliefs? But the other side is that Planned Parenthood isn't just an abortion service. It also does a lot with political financing. It's engaged very deeply in social activism. It's an education system that tends to be on the very far left hand of politics. So there's also a question about using taxpayer dollars for partisan and politically active organizations. Should we be funding an organization that basically exists on the far left of politics and tries to advance that? That's also the question. And that also ties into the broader picture of what we're watching now unfold. Many organizations that are now losing money, whether it's through USAID or having their budgets cut or people fired, many of them are politically active organizations, especially toward the far left of politics.
Yeah.
And look, even those that were not, well, there were accusations they were in turn giving money to deeply partisan organizations and movements. There was like a kind of a tree structure, right? Different branches, and the branches were growing the fruits of like far left groups and so on. And even with some of the major agencies, the concerns over politically partisan funding, using your tax dollars for what are just politically activist organizations, is becoming the backdrop of a lot of the investigations and spending cuts we're now watching from the Trump administration. Now, part of this ties into what are now being described as patronage networks. Patronage networks, right? Daily Signal said this. What's making Trump's move so effective is that many of these networks are based on government functions that long ago either waned in usefulness or have completely abandoned their purpose. And they say that's what freezing U.S. Agency for International Development funding was partly about. Foreign aid is already deeply unpopular with the American people, but what are we spending money on is just generic aid to potential international partners. Now, look, the story points to a few different areas. One of them, just as one of many examples, is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, look, on one side, the EPA help create regulations and oversight to protect American water and natural resources, basically making sure we're not messing up the environment, right? But the issue that's now being raised, since environmentalism was turned into a deeply partisan issue, mainly because of agendas like ESG, environmental and social governance, well, some of its programs also became painted in the light of these political issues. And this is actually being raised by the new EPA administrator himself. Lee Zeldin, the head of the EPA under Trump, spoke about this problem with Matt Gaetz on One American News. Watch this.
The EPA was absolutely being used to push out this green slush fund to their friends. By design, the director of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund leaves one of these NGOs, goes to work at the Biden administration to design this whole setup, and then sees his former employer get $5 billion. I mean, we've seen it on the smaller grants as well. One person who was a CEO of a nonprofit was serving on the White House Environmental Justice Council, applied for $20 million, got it, even though they only received just over $2 million over the course of the prior 3 years. So again, the more you dig into this, the more you realize that this was a green slush fund that was going to left-wing activist groups rather than going directly towards remediating environmental issues.
Of course, the narrative is going to be different if you hear from the other side. They say the cross-pollination of people between government positions and other groups, well, it's because they have the skills, they have the knowledge, the expertise, and so on. And also, look, environmental and social governance, ESG, that was a huge focus politically under the Biden administration. And effectively what that meant was this. Programs for that, ESG, were implemented throughout the entire government, all the government agencies alongside DEI. So obviously the EPA, which is focused on the environment, was deeply involved in that as well. But regardless, it does seem that the organization is being remade. And this is likewise going to impact all the other issues in nonprofits that its budget was also helping along, because the money was not just going within it, it was going to other organizations. And of course, given that ESG was also a deeply partisan issue, well, the money also ended up having deeply partisan connotations. But even aside from these organizations, news outlets, nonprofits that were getting government money and that are now being re-examined for partisan reasons, there's also more to this. The Trump administration is also restricting taxpayer money from going to organizations that hold on to issues like DEI, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll be talking about this more after we come back from a quick break.